It is Saturday, May the 27th, the year 2000. We are at the Atlanta History Center this Memorial Day weekend. Our interview this afternoon is with Mr. Pete Mitchell, who is an Atlanta resident.
Yes.
And we'll be discussing his experiences during the Vietnam War. First, let me just tell you thank you for sharing your time with us this afternoon. Appreciate it.
You're quite welcome.
And if you would, just begin by telling us, well, where are you from originally?
I was born in Staten Island, New York in 1940 and was raised essentially on Long Island from 1951 until I went to college. I graduated from Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania in 1961 and was commissioned in the Army at the time I graduated. However, I then attended law school at University of Pennsylvania for 2 years, decided I wasn't happy being an attorney, I thought at that time, and I took a leave of absence and then resumed my active duty career, started my active duty career.
I've talked to a couple of lawyers today.
I'm not a lawyer.
Right.
Never went back.
Right. Well, no, this is a nice change.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So, what year did you join the military?
I was activated in May of 1963, and I reported to Fort Benning, Georgia for the infantry officer's basic course. So basically, I'm an infantry officer. I stayed there and attended the 9-week Ranger course, which involved North Georgia and also Florida, and the 3-week Airborne course. Then my first duty station, I reported in to Fort Hood, Texas, to the 1st Armored Division the day that Kennedy was assassinated. So my first duty was nothing that I'd been trained to do. It was riot control.
Well, you never know. Okay, go ahead and just kind of trace any other areas you went to until you got to Vietnam.
1st Armored Division had the largest peacetime maneuver up to that point for armor since Patton at 38. So I was a division reconnaissance officer and an equipment train commander and took a brigade of tanks out to the Mojave Desert. So I reconnoitered the Mojave Desert prior to the beginning of that exercise for the 1st Armored Division. Then selected vehicles and personnel went to Camp Pendleton for amphibious training at the Marine Amphibious Warfare Center. Another interesting thing that I got involved with at Fort Hood as an additional duty was called SAWSTAT, the Small Arms Weapon System Troop Acceptability Testing. So in that genre, I had the ability to test the predecessor to the M16 and 2 or 3 other weapons systems for infantry people that the Army was looking at the time. Unfortunately, the purchase was made before the tests were completed. Another area that I was trained was I was sent down to Panama to the Jungle Operations School, and a lot of that training came in good stead, and that was in 1966, just prior to going to Vietnam.
Yeah, because that conditions were very similar there to Vietnam as far as weather,
Yeah.
type of terrain, I guess.
Especially terrain, vegetation, and riding around in tanks and armored personnel carriers, you tend to get a little bit out of shape, so it was good to get back in the actual packing the pack and swinging the machete. And I might add that during those time periods, your commitment was, if you were between 18 and 35, was based on a 7-year period. I could have chosen to be on active duty for 6 months and then a year and a half in the active reserves and then the balance and standby reserves. But in order to participate in that weapons test, I had already extended 1 year, and at that time, officers that did that were just in a category where you could voluntarily extend. So I could have gotten out and I didn't really have to go to Vietnam. But the assumption was that as a reserve officer with that specialized training, if I had a choice of putting in a request and going with a unit with a tradition and heritage of fighting or going with a unit that I didn't know about, I would rather go with people that I knew could do the job.
I mean, but that's pretty important in the military, units, if you're a member of a unit with a lot of tradition.
Morale, esprit de corps.
Exactly. So, where did you ship out from or fly out from?
I had a lot of additional duties at Fort Hood, and so I didn't take a lot of leave, and I'm probably one of the few people on the way to Vietnam that had 45 days of leave. So I went up to see some of my schoolmates at Philadelphia. I actually started my trek there and ended up in San Francisco, and then from there I went to Hawaii and actually got a chance to see Wake Island, flew out to Wake Island, and then to Japan, Hong Kong, the Philippines, where my brother-in-law and sister lived and had a business, and ended up in Vietnam in late April of 1966.
And what was your age and rank at the time?
I was a first lieutenant, and this was, I have to think now. I was 25 on the way over there, and after the first big battle I was in, I was 26. June 13th, 66.
Happy birthday, right? Okay, and so I do want to, to find out a little bit, concentrate on your experiences in Vietnam, and you want to just kind of start by telling us where you went into
Sure.
Vietnam at, and you were there for how long?
I was there for 18 months.
18 months. Okay.
Right.
So go ahead and just kind of.
At that time, most of the Army personnel were going into Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and they had a personnel placement center called Camp Alpha, which was just kind of a place with tents and sandbags and lots of activity and so forth. And then you were assigned to units, and in my case I had orders, but I still had to convince people there that they meant what they said and that I was supposed to go to the 101st Airborne. So I was there for about a day and a half. At that time, the Army had Caribou aircraft assigned to the Army, C-7 aircraft, and I noticed a warrant officer with 101st Patch, and I approached him, and he said that they were flying up to Phan Rang, which was the rear area base camp for the 101st, and so without further ado, I just asked him what time he was taking off, and I showed up at the plane, and I got up there. So I never officially did go through Camp Alpha. The 1st Brigade, the entire first year that they were there, didn't really have a base camp. They were called the Nomads of Vietnam, and in December of '66, just before Christmas, they were hitchhiked on an adjacent area to what would become an air base at Phan Rang, outside of the town of Phan Rang, put up some GP medium tents, celebrated Christmas, and took off again. So there were members of that unit that, unless they were wounded or going on R&R or DROs back to the States, never really spent any time there. When I arrived there in May of '66, they were the first organization in Vietnam to begin what they called P training. There was a definite need to acclimatize people, both to the people would be fighting against, the customs, the language, and more specifically the skills of the small unit weaponry. And so they had some live fire exercises, they had the barbed wire set up, they had patrolling, and this gave your body a chance to acclimatize to the tremendous heat and the humidity, and gave you an idea of what it was like, because the NCOs and officers that were doing that training had just come out of the field. So after P training, basically we were sent forward to join the 1st Brigade units. 1st Brigade had 3 infantry battalions, the 1st and 2nd of the 327th Infantry, which were glider troops in World War II, and the 2nd of the 502nd. And they were supported by a battalion of the 2nd of the 320th Artillery, and there was a battery assigned to each battalion. And basically, we were kind of General Westmoreland's fire unit. Wherever they thought there might be a problem, rather than sending a big division, they could send lighter equipped airborne troops. And basically, our method was the long-range patrolling and reconnaissance type of activities. We did have the artillery firepower, but we were somewhat bastards because we didn't have a lot of baggage and equipment. We would pick up units that were attached in the various military areas that we were located. So I joined them in Tu Corps, the southern part of Tu Corps, on the Cambodian border at an area known as Dak To. And the 2nd and the 502nd had just had a big battle there. And the other 2 battalions, one of the battalions, the 2nd and 327th, was at Tuiwa on the coast, several hundred miles away, guarding a rice harvest, and the entire brigade had fought there earlier in their visit. So the 2nd of the 502nd and the 1st of the 327th were basically disengaging from battle. At the time that I joined them, I walked in and I was assigned to the 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry. Didn't meet the commanding officer, but I was interviewed by a Major Aboud, who later on became a very successful battalion commander of the 2nd 327th. But at that time he was crusty. He was Arabic in complexion and had very piercing eyes, and he could care less what our ranks were or anything else. He knew that I was probably the senior first lieutenant in the battalion, but essentially what he said to me is, if you're going to stay in this battalion, you will be a platoon leader whether you like it or not, this and that. And I said, yes, sir. You know, what's my company? What's my platoon? So I was assigned to C Company of the 1st of 327th Infantry. Wayne Dill was the company commander. Wayne is currently retired in Georgia. He was originally from Waycross, and he's running the plant and equipment at the University of Georgia right now. He was a good company commander. Lots of activity. Most of the people that had come over with that in the first year with that unit were in the process of DEROS, that is, returning to the States. So there was a lot of flux. There were some people that came over with the brigade that had actually left earlier. So there's a lot of change in personnel. The original company commanders, original first sergeant, and a lot of the experienced NCOs were leaving. And again, this 12-month policy that the Army had some very serious repercussions for us. So I met my platoon sergeant, Dixon, from Wayne, Pennsylvania, and began to sit down with him while I was there at Dak To and to record the names of the people, the equipment, and get his feelings on things. He had only been there about 3 or 4 weeks, which I didn't know at that time but found out later. Contrary to one of the popular impressions that people in this country have, the average age of our fighting troops is 22 and 23 years old. It wasn't 18. I didn't have any draftees in the unit at all. These people were volunteers to be in the Army, and then they were volunteers to go through airborne training. So they weren't all what I would call gung-ho, but they were very proficient and sincere at what they did, a lot of close friendships. We moved from Dak To by C-130 to an area called Chio Rio, which was further up north in the 2 Corps area, and this was what was the reserve for what was called 1st Field Force. The areas of Vietnam were divided into field force areas. So 1st Field Force was actually in what the Vietnamese called 2 Corps, and it was essentially like a Corps headquarters, but they called it a field force not to confuse it with the Vietnamese Corps headquarters. So we were essentially there in a malarial swamp area for a couple of days, and again, I noticed a couple of things. One of the things is that the table of organization of equipment for an infantry company, an airborne infantry company, was around 147 people. I had a lot more names in my platoon than the 47 allotted on paper, but in fact there only seemed to be around 20 there. So another one of the problems we had in Vietnam was the morning report information was not entirely accurate in terms of the people actually in the field. So again, I had a lot of names that I had discussed with Platoon Sergeant Dixon, and then I'd go around looking for them, and they'd say, well, this fellow's been in the hospital, this fellow's on R&R in the States, this fellow was wounded, and so airborne units also had what they called airhead strength. So you had morning report strength, you had airhead strength, you had other types of reporting, but the reality was if you couldn't count them when you were there to fight, for all practical purposes, they weren't in the unit. So I did not have enough people to have 3 infantry squads in that platoon and a weapons squad. So we started experimenting. In the middle of our stay there in Chio Rio, which was supposed to be longer, there was a Vietnamese camp at Dak To that was under heavy mortar attack. This was along a traditional invasion route, and so not to have a political setback, the South Vietnamese government and General Westmoreland's staff decided that it would be good to evacuate these people from what was known as the Tumarang Ridge. And so our brigade was sent up there to do that. The 2nd of the 502nd and the 1st 327th were the only two battalions that went there. As I mentioned earlier, the 2nd of 327th was still in Tuiwa. To make a long story short, after that relief operation was in full swing, the brigade ended up in the largest battle that it had up to that point, and it became known as the Battle of Tumarang. But in essence, there was a Vietnamese column of troops and artillery that were sent up to an area north of Dak To. The 1st Brigade rear area was an airstrip near the Highway 14, which is a road that goes through Dak To. We were about 6 kilometers from a Vietnamese and American Special Forces camp, and that is where the brigade headquarters located. But there's an artillery unit not associated with the 1st Brigade, and some ARVN regular troops and a ranger company that were designated to go up in column and then meet trucks, and then the artillery battery would remain in place, and then the relief of Tumarang would begin. And the native troops, of course, had their wives, their dogs, their chickens, and everything else. So it was going to be quite an operation. The role of our battalion initially was to conduct an air assault north of there, that vicinity, where the enemy was suspected to be, and work our way back south toward the ridge at the same time that these other activities were going on. Colonel Meinzen was the battalion commander that I had briefly met twice, and on the day of the actual air assault, about 15 minutes began, a Major David Hackworth, who has written several books, came up to me and approached me. Our platoon was going to be the first one in of the regular line units. The recon units had already gone out to an area to secure some routes for us. So that was actually the beginning of my acquaintance with Dave Hackworth, and also the beginning of the battle. So the column was hit by the North Vietnamese, who apparently there in a rest area and observed this column moving. The only thing that threw their plans off at the last minute, the brigade commander, General Pearson, decided to put a 101st artillery battery from the 2nd and 320th. And lo and behold, that was landed right in the valley, which these North Vietnamese apparently were observing. So we had an American unit with a battery, and then for some unexplained reason, this Vietnamese column with the American advisor just stopped and pulled off somewhere else, which would be a terrible mistake when you're fighting overwhelming forces. Apparently, when the North Vietnamese attacked, though, they made the mistake of trying to attack both of them at the same time rather than trying to defeat them one at a time. But that battle raged all night. They attempted to overrun the artillery battery. They attempted to overrun the ARVN column and the ARVN Ranger unit. They suffered heavy casualties. They captured 2 of the 6 artillery pieces briefly. They were fought back. That's the first time that our unit used the flechette rounds. It was very close in fighting. And the infantry units, meanwhile, were north and scattered. So at first light, the morning of the 6th, my company, with Wayne Dill commanding, and the other companies were brought to the artillery battery. I was assigned a Vietnamese dog handler who didn't speak English, and a dog. And the fighting strength of our mighty platoon was 21, of which 1 was the Vietnamese dog handler who didn't speak English, 1 was a medic, 1 was a corporal, which at that time in the Army was a rank that you were busted to, but it was no longer an NCO rank like it was in the Marines. Corporal Hanley, who was a great soldier, but from the weapons platoon, who was a forward observer. And a lot of the other troops were carrying PRC-25 radios. And so if you actually look at the weapons that we had to fire, it was less than 10. But our job at first light was to regain contact with those North Vietnamese units. And my Captain Dill's company in particular was to go up the west flank of and cross the Dak To River and proceed northward, seeing if we could make contact with stragglers or at least find the point of entry from which the North Vietnamese gained access into the area. And B Company went up the middle, north, and A Company was on the right flank. And then our battalion reconnaissance, which was called the Tiger Force, who was already in the area, was inserted into another direction. And to make a long story short, from June 6th, we had a 17-day battle that ended with us marching out, hopefully victorious. But several problems confronted us other than the terrain and the enemy. One was the rules of engagement. This battle took place near a border, and even though we could defeat the enemy, we couldn't always pursue to a final conclusion. But we fought the 18B Regiment, which was the name of the regiment. S.L.A. Marshall wrote a book about this battle. It was not well received. It came out at a time that the war was unpopular. It was called, I'll think of the name in a few minutes, but in that there's a couple of chapters on the 1st Brigade just talking about the Battle of Dak To, and he did interview a lot of company commanders and NCOs and
Is
stuff.
there any way to describe?
Battles in the Monsoon, that was the name. Okay. Well, I have the map, but the map would be somewhat boring.
I mean, we're talking about
I made contact. Oh, yes.
Artillery and...
Well, let me give you an example. The first night that we crossed the Dak To River and reported back to the company commander, a battalion plan was devised and communicated to Captain Dill. And in essence, at first light the second morning of this battle, I was to drop our big rucksacks with the several days' rations and equipment and take my people east back across the river on the ridgeline, set up an ambush, and then 2nd Platoon with Lieutenant Kirby Young was to proceed south, and kind of like the Indians from India with the elephants and beating the brushes and so forth, and the intent was to drive people into our ambush. So we had mortars registered and everything else, and we're there for several hours. So just before noon, Captain Dill called me on the radio. We didn't use a lot of code because we were tactical. I mean, they use things like 6 for company commander and 5 for XO, and, so if anybody sophisticated was listening, it would be pretty obvious. But essentially, the message to me was to cease that mission and to come up on the battalion radio net and to assume another mission. And when I did that, essentially the S3 section, the operations section, told me that our recon force was taking heavy casualties. They were in a bad situation. I was to proceed to their location. They didn't say that the fellow in charge was a captain, but I knew that he was. And so essentially I was to take orders from that person when I got there. And looked at the map. They asked me for an estimate. We simply had, we call it LBE, load-bearing equipment. We simply had the suspender straps and fanny packs, ponchos, and 1/3 of a day's meal, because the intent was to go back. So we forgot that mission right away and proceeded with the other. One of the things I had done when I met with Sergeant Dixon the first time was to enumerate all the equipment that we physically had there. We only had 2 Lanzetta compasses, one for him and one for me. The big thing that hurt us was we only had 2 machetes, and it was determined that we would not take trails. We knew the enemy was there. There were certain areas that we had to bypass that were very marshy, but we had to get into low area and then proceed up a ridge line, and there was a trail there, and we would find that, and we would move parallel but not close to the trail. And the physical exertion for everybody involved was just amazing. If there was water to drink, it would be replenishing the gallons that each one of these young men lost. But without complaint, they took their turns on the machete. I was essentially moving in what's called a modified column. I had to take that machine gun squad, that weapons squad, and break it up because we were so short of personnel, and assign a machine gun and 1 ammo bearer to each remaining squad. We had 3 M79 40mm grenade launchers with us, a couple of M16s. The radio people carried rifles. I had a medic that had a .45. I wasn't sure whether or not it was authorized. I didn't ask him, but it came in very handy, as I'll explain shortly. So we got fairly close to where this activity was taking place. Initially, we could hear nothing. We were in triple canopy jungle. Underneath the jungle, in many places, there was very thick bamboo clumps, which were impenetrable, and you couldn't see through them. So we were in an area of limited visibility on terrain where the contour intervals were 60 feet. The maps were suspect because initially when they were made, it was obvious that people, unless they were under the canopy, couldn't be exactly accurate in terms of the undulations of the terrain. And as we got closer, air support that Captain Higginbotham, who was the Tiger Force leader, called in, was bombing the area. The problem with extremely steep terrain is that the troops that it's designed to help may or may not be in defilade, in other words, out of the range of the artillery, which would be the desired effect, and that the bad guys get pounded. But they didn't know where we were. So when I got within radio range and got on the platoon net for Captain Higginbotham, I had to give him a direction which I was approaching. And as we were getting closer, I was telling him that the shrapnel and trees and all sorts of things were sailing through the air. And I didn't know precisely where he was. So my plan was going to be to put my platoon on line and maneuver to where I thought he would be. About that time, some shots rang out in the back of my column, and we'd shot a couple of the enemy, and it was apparent from what was happening that they weren't attacking. It looked like they might have been trying to get out of the area. All this was split-second guess. I had a point man in front of each squad. I had Brad Coombs in point man in charge of one squad, out in front of one squad, and I had Carmi Guyette, who was another young man out in front of the other one. And about that time, Brad Coombs was hit in the ankle. And the problem that I had as a platoon leader, I was in the process of changing from a column to a line. And the platoon sergeant who was behind me, who they knew better than I did, stood up for some reason, ran forward, and 2 or 3 other young men followed him. And as it turned out, the enemy was between the Tiger Force and myself, and we had a extremely fierce firefight at less than 40 feet. So when our people hit the ground, they were facing downhill in one of these unmarked terrain features. I had my web gear shot off. The machine gunners were hit. I had 6 casualties in about 30 seconds, and the other people had jammed their weapons into mud. So the only thing that we had that fired was the M79. Brad Coombs, the first one that was hit several more times. Carmi Guyette was hit several times. The platoon sergeant was hit 4 times. My machine gunners were hit, and it was a bad scene. And so then the problem is, do you continue to move forward? Do you consolidate? What do you do? So I had to call Higginbotham, who obviously was right in the middle of it. He had already sustained 16 casualties out of about 40 people. And so I just told him what was going on, told the battalion commander, and I said, I have lost my momentum. If you want me to, I will attack, but I've got people out there that are not on my perimeter, and I've got some that are seriously hit here. And by the way, we're surrounded by bunkers, which we had not seen at that point in time. So in reality, as we discovered a few days later, we were actually in the center of the resting area for this unit that we were fighting that had been sent down from North Vietnam. So they probably didn't prepare that area, but it was a prepared, defensible position for them from both air power and from infantry. And we were actually inside their defenses.
Somebody commented earlier on how, like, if you were in the triple layer canopy, that it just narrowed your options down as far as getting any type of air support.
Yeah, they couldn't tell you where you are, first of all. He, if I could show you on the map, he was in a saddle. So the enemy was actually on the hills over him, and he was strung out in a single file and had dead and wounded people extending for over 300 feet that he didn't exactly know where they were. My unit was compact. Our problem was that we were caught in the middle of a maneuver, which was necessary. The enemy obviously heard the shooting, And the other thing was, and I say this with love and respect, the platoon sergeant was known. Why he did what he did, other than aiding people, is hard to explain. But when he went forward standing, some young men who had been in combat before, but probably not with North Vietnamese regulars, and in entrenched situations like that, did the same. And so that was a very bad scene. The medic with the 45 pulled us out of the bacon, because my intention would have been to maneuver and then have the medic go, because that's how close we were to our points and everybody else. The reality is, though, that if anybody should have been out there, it was him, which he was. And so this very brave young man was actually below the fellas shooting at us. There was an RPG machine gun shooting at us, and he was able to kill that person with his 45, and he was able to get another North Vietnamese who had an AK-47. So that relieved the pressure. We were able to then start searching the foxholes and actually captured 2 prisoners and some other weapons. Why that Vietnamese dog didn't alert, I don't have the faintest idea. He ended up shot in the nose. But we ended up with a very small perimeter. The Tiger Force was strung out, as we found out the next day, less than 40 feet from us, and this enemy bunker line, of which there was many, was in between us. So I agonized for years about the inability to get Brad Coombs back into our line, and Carmi Guyette we did get back, and I'll explain what happened to him. But the platoon sergeant Dixon died in my arms about 4:30 that morning. Basically, what the battalion commander did at that time was correct. A company was on the move to that area. Our 2nd platoon was on the move to that area. It was extremely murky conditions in terms of the light conditions. It was very dark, actually. And so rather than everybody moving around and probably shooting our own people up, our orders were to stay where we were. A company would come in and secure the entire area, and then at first light they would try to get in and get us out. We did not have organic helicopter ambulance support at that time. In fact, there was no Army helicopter unit available that was able to come in, and there wouldn't have been any place for them to land anyway. So the Air Force had a plane, a chopper with booms on it called a CH, I want to say 54 Husky. But it did have what's called a jungle penetrator. So after midnight and toward morning, they flew over there. And apparently we're getting shot at, but if we couldn't see them above the canopy, the enemy really couldn't either, so it was sporadic fire. And they were able to get an engineer team down with chainsaws, and they did get 1 or 2 wounded people out. But about 5:30 in the morning, one of the best sights that I can remember from Vietnam was seeing a Sergeant E6 Long bust through from A Company to where we were. You know, we didn't shoot him, and so we were consolidated, and we managed to get up the hill to where the Tiger Force was. And there was confusion. There was dead bodies all over the place with tarps, their own ponchos. There was a continuing mission going on. A Company was essentially ordered to move out and regain contact with this regiment. Actually, it was the 24th B Regiment. I think I told you it was 18B. And there was additional people dropped in to support us. They basically cleaned out the rear area, so we were somewhat of a bastardized group. We had engineers, and we had truck drivers, and we had anybody that they could find. So the job of the remaining people, after we got the dead and wounded out, was to get in there and see, in fact, what was there. And there was more weapons that we picked up, light infantry weapons, than we could physically get out of there. And so the order was to blow a lot of them in place. But what we found there was well-concealed kitchens where they had bamboo piping for smoke. They were near but not in water sources, and it was a well-prepared place. They had stones cut in clay for walking up and down. And while that was going on, as I said, A Company was sent to continue the mission to bite this unit in the rear. In the meantime, 2nd Battalion, 502nd Infantry was ordered into battle, and they dropped Captain Carpenter, the famous lonesome man from West Point, in an area which, as it turned out, was the front of the area that the enemy was trying to escape. And his unit was almost overrun. And in fact, it got so desperate that he called napalm in on his own troops. And Hank Emerson, Colonel Hank Emerson, who was the battalion commander, was going to put him in for the Medal of Honor and all that stuff. Well, as it turned out, his executive officer was somebody that I'd served with for 2 years. So after the battle, I got to talk with him and talked to First Sergeant Sablowski, who was a three-war soldier, who was the first sergeant of that company in that battle. And he was getting worked over. A company hit the rear of this regimental column, and they were conducting what I would call a perfect retrograde movement. They had small units in the rear whose sole job was to attack the enemy, and then if the enemy got through, then the next unit would attack them and so forth. And so A company was doing such a good job of penetrating their columns that they slammed a whole battalion around into Ben's company, and he was in low ground. They also had 57 millimeter anti-aircraft guns that they started firing at his company. So he was locked in a messy battle. This is about a third one in 3 days. He was in low ground. First Lieutenant Collins, that went over on the same orders that I did, lost an eye. Kirby Young from our 2nd platoon had lost an eye. There's a lot of dead and wounded. And Colonel Hackworth insisted, that he was going to send in choppers and lights and everything else, and they got into a very heated argument over the phone. In fact, Ben Willis was saying, if you want to run my damn company, then you get down here. I told you that I'm okay. Yes, I have casualties. I can get out, and we don't need to create a ruckus and pinpoint my location. So, of course, we were listening to this on the radio. I was now second in command to Captain Higginbotham. We had this bastard group of about 45 or 50 people, and our mission was going to be to continue on another axis and regain contact with this unit, the North Vietnamese unit. Instead, it became going to the rescue of A company and returning the favor. So half of us went and established an area where we could carve out a landing zone so that he could get out his dead and wounded, and Captain Higginbotham led a unit to link up with him along a creek bed. Interesting thing about warfare, there are soldiers on the ground from both sides of a conflict that will exercise humanity or decency. And the North Vietnamese, in contact with Ben's company, were in the same position that he was, a lot of dead and wounded. And so Ben elected to slide off these muddy, rainy, messy hills down into the creek and took all of his dead and wounded and actually formed a column and walked out of his encirclement. Enemy troops on both sides saw what was going on. They were in a bivouac area. Weapons were pointed at each other, and nobody fired. And so that was, a great tribute to the basic humanity of most people and the common sense. So he got back to our perimeter. Dead and wounded were immediately taken up. New troops were put in, returned back to battle, regained contact with the 24th B Regiment. The whole purpose of regaining contact, by this time there's other elements involved. The 1st Cavalry Division, 1st Air Cav had a battalion that was involved. The South Vietnamese had committed other people. So the bottom line was that on the Knock Rum Ridge, K-N-O-K-R-U-N-G Ridge, they were pretty certain that they had the main elements of this enemy regiment. And so a B-52 strike was called in, and the bombers took off from Guam. So our mission became to contain that unit and to hit them here and back off the hills and hit them there and make them assume that they're under continuous ground assault and a threat to be overrun. And then after midnight on this battle, the heavy fighting was the 6th, 7th, 8th, the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, and then the night of the 12th. We were to run like hell and get across what they called the no fire line or the no bomb line, whatever they called it. But essentially, we were fighting high up in the mountains, and we had to get back to the old Dak To River, where I had left on the morning of the 5th, and cross that river. And then choppers would be there to pick up my company, C Company. I would be detached from Captain Higginbotham's unit, moved back to C Company. We'd be picked up, flown back to the artillery base where it all began, and then as soon as the bombs were dropped, we'd air assault right back on top of the hill, which is what happened. So I had a couple of disappointments. got back to the company area with my platoon, and all of our rucksacks were gone. They'd been thrown on a chopper and taken back to the artillery battery. So we didn't have personal effects. One of the things that I had made in the Philippines was called a bolo. It was a much smaller machete that I frankly wish I had had in the preceding days. And that turned up missing with a nice hand-carved deal. And I don't think that the soldiers in the units took it because they had all personal effects, but we didn't have organic transportation, and then we didn't know everybody when we got back to that artillery area. And so we were there for less than 20 minutes, loaded on other choppers, went back to the top of the hill, and there was a large number of North Vietnamese prisoners taken, none by my platoon, but it was almost impossible to get down to the actual ground level because the bombs dropped were called daisy cutters. They were 500-pound bombs. Most of them would explode on the ground and not do a lot of damage. So spikes or metal extensions had been welded on several of them so that when they exploded, they actually exploded and they were not airbursts above the tree canopy, but airburst among the tree canopy. And so bamboo is very resilient stuff. It doesn't break, it just kind of bends. So it was extremely difficult trying to go through the area. The prisoners that were captured invariably suffered internal injuries from the concussive effects of the bombs, and they were going to have headaches for a long time. So after 2 or 3 days of policing that battlefield, there was 2 or 3 other operations run in the area. But 17 days after it began, which I believe was the 19th of June, Colonel Hackworth had the colors issued to all the infantry units. But essentially, we did a forced march from the fighting area back to Dak To and passed in review, and then went to our bivouacs, which were another 3 miles down the road.
What's the hardest thing, describing this days of action of battles? What wears on you more than anything?
Now or then?
Both.
Then it was, things happened so fast and you were physically exhausted. And I think most young men in battle are afraid that they're going to be cowards or this or that, but the fact is things happen so fast you don't have time to think. Days later, when I thought about it, I began to second guess what I'd done. Nobody likes to take casualties. I'd lost an experienced platoon sergeant, and so I went to the first sergeant and said, geez, how long has this guy been here, whatever. You do the letter writing and all those things and put people in for medals. I had some very excellent soldiers. Carmi Gayet, I never knew what happened to him, didn't see him. I just knew that he had a severely shattered elbow and was hit, and he was airlifted to Japan. So eventually, when we got back to Dak To, which is the first place that we could get, a lot of the company clerks had been transferred. Wayne Dill came down with malaria. I was promoted to captain. David Hackworth called me out in the field and chewed me out. I had very minor fragmentation types of shrapnel in my legs, not enough to go to we went to the medic, but out in the field. We also went to combat. That was a so-called elite airborne unit, but the replacements went into combat with the uniforms that they brought from the States. No jungle fatigues, no nothing. That unit, with no supply system that was reliable, when I joined the platoon, it was almost embarrassing to see people with commo wire holding their pants up. And no jungle boots. slick leather boots. So the combination of the bad boots and the shrapnel, my feet were in pretty bad shape, and I had what was called tetracycline. That's what they gave you then to protect you from trench foot and infection and everything else. So I was standing there with my sleeves rolled up, and he came over, and braced me and chewed me out, this and that, and slapped my captain bars on and said, "Here you are." So the bad part about that transaction, how I felt was, the company commander wrote the letters that I would have preferred to write. I knew that Brad Coombs was 23 years old and from Los Angeles, but I didn't have his complete address. I knew that Platoon Sergeant Wayne Dixon was from Pennsylvania, and I knew his brother was an airborne soldier, and I didn't have a chance to write because I'm sure he would have questions like I would. And I was given a different duty. I was one of the few officers that had logistic experience. They had a big inspection coming up, so they sent me back to the rear area, clean it up for inspection, and that's another story in itself. But after that battle, I did get to talk to Brian Robbins from 2nd of the 502nd and some other people. It's a small world. Ran into a college classmate from Lafayette, Sam Watson, who was a lieutenant with the 2nd of the 327th, who'd come up there.
Ran into him over there. I mean, you were.
Yeah, it ran into him in the battalion area. They did, in fact, come up to join us for a while. Ran into him, got a chance to talk to him briefly. But the big thing I worried about for years and years and years was, when you lose life like that, did I do the right thing? Could I have done this and done that? So if I had anything remotely resembling delayed stress syndrome, it was playing Monday night quarterback with yourself. I was very impressed. 3 things leave a very great impression on me. When Captain Higginbotham and Captain Willis and Captain Dill and Dave Hackworth and Jerry White and all these people were talking on the radio in absolutely desperate situations. No cursing, no anger, no high emotion. It was just amazing to me what shape they were in and how they were able to deal with it effectively. In 1975, I was involved in Georgia with the president, with President Ford's campaign to be elected in his own right. And I was calling people late at night, and I saw Willis, Ben F., LTC, Lieutenant Colonel. I said, this can't be the same guy that I knew as a company commander in Vietnam. He's living in Riverbend Apartments in Cobb County. I called him out of the blue, and once we established who we were, guess what the first question was that he had to me? He said, I remember that night in 7 June 1966 at Dak To. If I had gotten there any earlier, would Sergeant Dixon have been alive? And I had to say to him, no. I said, the medic did first aid, second aid. We went through every can of Albion we had. We were considering live transfusions. Sergeant Dixon was hit 4 times, including in the femoral artery, and this guy had actually gone in with the help of another soldier and had clamps in there. And this is a fellow that's not a doctor or out without a lot of substantial medical training. So I put him in for a Silver Star, which he got. He was somewhat of a troublemaker apparently in the rear area, and it's difficult when you have somebody killed and other people injured to put somebody in and then make it stick and get it for him. So to this day I hope he wears it with pride, but he earned it.
And I'm sure that is a common thing, second guess things like that. The hindsight's 20/20. It's
I know, but it takes a long time to realize that, and that was difficult. And since then, as I said, I've met with platoon members. Let me get back to Carmi Guyette. I found out that my platoon was meeting in Catlett, Virginia, on the farm of one of my machine gunners, Ken Isle, who was with me. And after several years, immediately when I found out that they were meeting, I went up there, called David Cook in Maine, who was a mortar sergeant in the company, but knew a lot of people in that platoon, told him I'd like to be at the next one. And I have met the company commander that originally took C Company over, who goes to those reunions. I've met the first sergeant that took the company over. I've met all of the lieutenants who commanded the platoon previous to me that are still alive. They have one company commander that's dead. And so it was emotional initially, but they don't go there to tell war stories. They go there to be with their family. And when I found out that Carmi Guyette was alive and well, I called him in West Hartford, Connecticut, went up to meet him. And it was he that told me, Pete, you know, I saw Brad Coombs die. Yes, there were people screaming that night and crying, and he said, I'm here to tell you that they were the enemy soldiers. And he said some of them were Tiger Platoon. He said I could reach out and touch them where I was. I just couldn't get to them.
So the camaraderie continues to be an important
Yes.
thing then?
As we speak, they'll be meeting June 25th. I'm going in for carotid surgery, unfortunately, but they are meeting the 25th in Catlett, Virginia. The brigade is having a reunion, which we have every 2 years at Fort Benning. This year they've had one in Savannah in Georgia and at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. So they're still very close.
We can back up and cover anything we want
Yeah.
to, but when you came home, what type of reaction, you know, we hear a lot about the anti-war movement and protest, and not to say that, you know, that was the
Well,
national mood, but there's a lot of that, you know, going on.
well, you got to remember, I was still on active duty, and this was fairly early in the war. And I came back to Georgia. I didn't come back to you know, a liberal arts campus or whatever. Let me just finish what I did in Vietnam. I was briefly in Phan Rang. Then I became an S4, which is the logistic officer, and replaced a fellow who took over the Tiger Force. Rejoined the battalion at Tuiwa on the coast. And then from Tuiwa, we fought a series of camp battles up and down the coast. We were there to help the 4th Infantry Division make its entry into the country and secure their base camps. The year before I got there, this brigade did the same thing for the 1st Cav. But we actually secured the highway to An Khe and secured An Khe until their troops were ashore and the base camp was under construction. We also did that for the Rock Whitehorse Division, which came in just south of Tuiwan. And Cameron, of course, was well underway at this point in time. So there was fighting along Highway 1, never had any convoys ambushed. And there's many times that I would go from Phan Rang to Nha Trang, which is where we had a medical facility where our troops were stationed, and that was the Special Forces, 5th Special Forces had a headquarters there. And more importantly, 1st Field Force, and the commander of 1st Field Force was a prior division commander. So he would offer his accommodations to young officers in many cases. So there's lots of occasions I had to go up there to check on people in the hospital and so forth. So we fought around Tuiwa, and while we were there, they had one of the worst typhoons that had ever struck the Vietnamese coast, and lost all of our tonnage and a good deal of equipment. The 95th B was an enemy regiment that operated in that entire coastal plain, and the significance of the coastal plain was the rice harvest, which was there every year. So there was fighting in places like Mai Con and Zuc Mi, Can Duong, which is where the Vietnamese had a ranger training facility area. And then in December of '66, in November of '66, we went down to Phan Thiet, which is almost to Saigon, and fought some campaigns there, and fought between Phan Thiet and Phan Rang. And we went north again to Tuiwa, and then we flew up to Kon Tum. So I remember serving Thanksgiving dinner to troops in the field in the areas west of Tuiwa. Almost 90% of the troops had trench foot. It just rained, it was hot, it was miserable, it was humid, extremely bad. Had some fighting going on there, but the fighting in Kon Tum province, which is a traditional invasion route, was considered, you know, key to get us up there. And so the whole brigade basically backed out of action there, loaded on C-130s, and moved the whole brigade up to Kon Tum. And this time we were just north of Kon Tum City, as opposed to being in Dak To. Weather was substantially different. Harder for the choppers to fly because the air was thin, much higher elevations. The the difference in temperature wasn't like 50 or 60, but it was 25 degrees cooler in the daytime and about 40 degrees cooler at night than where the troops had been. And so there was a lot of colds and a lot of snuffling and all that other stuff. At that time, my sister was having a baby, her first child, in the Philippines. And so I didn't get R&R, but I took 5 days leave. And after I helped move them up there, I went back to went to the Philippines for 5 days, from the 19th to the 24th. And came back Christmas Eve. One of the things I learned over there, and I used to preach to my troops, you're actually safer with the combat troops than you are, because there is no such thing as rear areas. So always have your weapon, always be careful, this and that. The night that I left the battalion, I was in a transient BOQ area in a tent, and everybody laughed at me when I dug in. I put my little sleeping bag in the hole and had my rifle with me. That night, that area was hit by just a few probably local guerrilla types. Shot up the place. 2 or 3 transit officers sat up and were wounded. Me, I was down in the hole coughing, but I was okay. So I use that story many.
Nobody laughed about that anymore.
But when I came back from the Philippines, rejoined them at Khartoum, and at that time, a lot of people don't know, but there was an airborne operation that was conducted. I can't remember if it was called Cedar Falls or Junction City. And the 1st Brigade was actually tapped to do it, but because the fighting got heavy at Khartoum, we were unable to do it. So the 173rd actually made that jump about a month later. But nevertheless, when I rejoined them, if you weren't out fighting, you were doing PT and running 5 miles every day. And we actually did 2 practice jumps at Khartoum, which on the Khartoum airfield. So a lot of people have written me and said, you know, so-and-so doesn't believe that I did this. And I said, well, I have my notes. I can tell you what stick you're in and what day you jumped, because manifests are kept of jumping activity. So I was running along there one morning, and Brad Muchler, who was a great battalion surgeon, said to me, Captain Mitchell, come into my tent. I want to see you for a few minutes. So I took my temperature, and I had about 103-degree temperature and all that other stuff, and he just absolutely told me that I was going to the hospital. I was not going to the field. So I ended up in Pleiku at a medical evacuation hospital with a bunch of other people. And one of the exciting things that happened there that night was the airfield was attacked by either North Vietnamese regulars or by guerrilla troops. And about that time, the lights went out. I had an IV, and you didn't have, in the evacuation hospitals, they didn't have enlisted an officer and NCO wards. It was kind of all the same until they sorted you out and got you to a field hospital. So First Sergeant, who was back on his second tour, was over there, and I had just seen him briefly several months before, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I pulled my IV out and got under the bed. The medics had not been under fire, and they were in there jamming magazines into their M14s, and one of them popped it back, and we decided we didn't want to accidentally be shot by medics. So it was an eventful night. It was obvious to us that the mortar fire was further away. But one of the funny things that happened next is most soldiers and nurses over there had to treat combat wounds, and they were trained in other specialties. So one of the things that was done when you were moved from an evacuation hospital to a field hospital is they put a tag on your foot, you know, labeling what your condition was. And so I ended up down on the coast at Quinnon in the hospital at Quinnon, and all the doctors would gather around like excited kids, you know, picking out new puppies to look at the toe tags. And so I had an internal medicine doctor who got me, and it was probably the happiest day of his life. He didn't have to treat anybody with gunshot wound. And I'm sure I spent an extra few days in the hospital because of that.
So you went home from the hospital? Or
No. Oh, no. Went back, joined the unit at Phan Rang. I was still the S4. We fought down to Phan Thiet again. Phan Thiet was right on the, it was a very sandy area on the beach, but it was very arid. And one of the biggest problems we had down there was the lack of water. So we came up with all sorts of techniques to get water to our troops. The 5-gallon metal jerry can, a lot of units had that, and we would place 4 of them on a pallet and tie the lids down to them, place another pallet on top and strap them and drop them from choppers. Of course, that was dangerous if you were below and didn't work too well. There was usually a lot of damage. And then somebody came up with the idea of what they called elephant rubbers. But they were weather units that had the weather balloons, and we could actually get them and put another weather balloon inside and fill it with water, not all the way, and those things seemed to work a little better because they had a little give. So one of the interesting things about all warfare, all endeavors of mankind, is people are always inventing a better mousetrap or finding a way to do something that needs to get done. So that was very arid. Came back to Phan Rang. The unit was engaged again up around Zuc Mi and Can Zwang, and then we boarded landing craft at Nha Trang and moved up to I Corps for the first time. The Marines had a huge area. I Corps, just like the Army did, the activity up along the DMZ was getting more intense. So with General Westmoreland's consent or advice or whatever, they were able to move more combat troops up to the DMZ, and we moved by landing craft to a place called Duc Pho, not Duck Co, Duc Pho, PHO. And that was on the really first town where the Marines had a base. They called it Camp Montezuma, I believe. It was an airfield. And while I was S4, I was always asking my battalion commander, who at this time was Colonel Rogers, why don't I have an infantry company? And he said words to the effect, well, I didn't know you were making a career out of the service, you know, this and that. And I said, Colonel, these are cross rifles, and every time we bring somebody new in here, the learning curve for new officers or senior NCOs costs casualties. I've been in battle. I know what's going on. I've got the time and grade. I want a company. So he said to me, well, you can have a company. You know, we've just filled them all, but you're going to have to extend for at least 6 months in Vietnam. I said, done. So a lot of people, you know, have asked me later, why have you done that? That sounds dumb. Well, when you're attached to a group of people, you're not fighting for mom and apple pie or whatever. You're trying to take care of people who are putting their lives on the line. If you've got a certain skill or knowledge that can be used for that purpose, and it was my feeling that that would be good in the long run for them and for me.